All right, so in the last two videos, I built my OPNsense firewall using the Protect LI firewall appliance. Then the next video, I implemented network-wide ad blocking using or through the use of DNSBL. But we still had one big problem. Even though the OPNsense was up and running, it wasn't actually controlling my network. My Verizon was still handling the routing, DHCP, and it was acting as the gateway for every device in my house. So what we're doing today is pretty much taking the next big step. I'm going to disconnect the Verizon router, completely removing it from the internet connection, and I'll just make all the routing go through the Protect LI appliance. Now, my goal is to make sure that this OPNsense functions as my primary router, and I want to make sure that the Verizon ISP router functions as solely a wireless access point. So if everything just kind of goes to plan, then OPNsense will take over routing, it will take over DNS, DHCP, all of the firewall duties. And like I said, Verizon or the Verizon router will be pretty much just an access point. So let's see how it goes.
Looking at the WAN interface on OPNsense, you can notice that it's still receiving a private IP address from the Verizon router. That means it's not actually connected directly to the internet yet. But here we can take a look that we still have that LAN connection. We'll be moving around a few cables just to make sure we can get that disconnected and moved to the correct spot on our device. So what I'm doing is removing the ISP connection from the Verizon router. I'm doing this in order to move it over to the Protect LI and replacing that LAN connection that we had on the WAN interface on the Protect LI. So what we're seeing here is basically just removing the other end of that LAN 1 connection that we had on our Verizon router. So this is port 2 on our Protect LI. We're just removing that connection. This was initially providing internet connection to our Protect LI appliance. Now what we're doing is making sure that the ONT device, which is the modem, is connected directly to that port 2 on the Protect LI device. Now we made sure that we have some activity on that. We can go back to making the connection to the Verizon via LAN port using our Aruba switch. We want to make sure we have internet and we have the Verizon working as an access point. And that's why we are making that connection on our switch port 3 back to the Verizon using any of the available LAN ports. And since we were already using LAN port 1, let's go ahead and use that again. Just to quickly summarize where we're currently at, we have our Protect LI connected to switch port 1 on the Aruba switch. Then we have our WAN connection coming from our ONT, which is directly from the ISP to the Protect LI port 2. Then we have our Verizon LAN port 1 connected to the Aruba switch port 3. Now we can see all these crazy lights going off on our all devices, and once we get back to our OPNsense portal, we can see that the WAN is still active with that private IP addressing, and that's not something that we want, right? So we go and log into our Verizon router, and from here we go into that advanced menu. We go ahead and search for the IPv4 address distribution. So what we're doing here is pretty much making sure that we change over that DHCP server setting that we see here over to disabled instead. We no longer have the Verizon performing as a DHCP server, and what we want to try to do is change that management IP address just to make things a little bit prettier. It's not a need, it's just to make things easier when you do want to access your Verizon and you want to make any changes. So what I want to do is make sure that it's within the same IP addressing space that we said before, which is the .50. Unfortunately, even after confirming that DHCP was disabled on the Verizon router, it continued refusing the change. So at this point, I wasn't sure if I had missed something or if it was the Verizon firmware that was being stubborn, but I just went on to the OPNsense dashboard, and from here I was able to tell that we now have a public IP address. And before we do any more troubleshooting, I just wanted to make sure that I created a backup of the OPNsense configuration. At this point, the migration was working, and I just wanted to make sure that we had a restore point before making any additional changes. So we'll click into System, and then we'll click into Configuration, Backups, Click on the download configuration. Just make sure you download that config file somewhere safe, somewhere secure that you can access it whenever you do need it or you might need it. Now it came time to test the network. I connected my iPhone to Wi-Fi and I checked the network details. The phone itself received a .50 address, which was exactly what we were looking for. And more importantly, the gateway was now .50.1, that is 192.168.50.1, and that confirmed that the OPNsense was handling DHCP and routing for wireless devices. Even though the Verizon router was still providing Wi-Fi, it was no longer functioning as the router. At this point, I was pretty much sure that everything was working as needed, and our Verizon now became the access point that we needed in order to manage Wi-Fi. Now, even though everything else was pretty much working, I still wanted to solve the issue with the Verizon management IP. I checked everything from, OpenSense neighbor discovery, but to kind of start off things, I ran an ARP-A command just to see if the MAC address for, our Verizon was anywhere to be found. Then I went over to our OpenSense. There, I tried the automatic discovery tool. I tried searching for another MAC address, anything that could just hit me towards finding out what this new IP address was. I also tried the same thing on the switch since it was directly connected to the Verizon. Nothing there as well. I also ran advanced IP discovery, wasn't able to find an IP address. And after trying everything else and exhausted every other portion of my troubleshooting, I just thought maybe just the IP didn't really change and it was still that 1.1 address. So I went back to that same address space using the 192.168.1.10 followed by all of the information you see on the screen. And as you can see, I was able to directly connect to our Verizon once again. Now, just to keep in mind, I am plugging my laptop directly into the Verizon router just to make sure that I can connect to it. So this is also following the IP address update that we made just recently. And just for old time's sake, I wanted to give it a try and see if I can change the management IP. Even after, waiting all this time and giving it a second try, I tried so many different things to get this thing working, but outside of resetting the device, which is not something that I was looking to do now since everything else was working, it failed. So this is something that I'll have to revisit down the road. I'm sure some of you might be interested in seeing how we can change that management IP address to something that is just easier or within our IP address range.
And with that, the migration is finally complete. OPNsense is finally my primary router for my house. It's handling everything from routing, DHCP, DNS, as well as firewall duties. And the Verizon router is nothing more than just an access point at this point. Yeah. Overall, I can pretty much say that the process went a lot smoother than I expected. I thought there were going to be a lot more hiccups or it would involve a lot more troubleshooting from my end. OPNsense pulled a public IP address pretty much basically immediately. All of my devices came back online. I just had to refresh a few devices to make sure they were connected to the new IP address. And now my network is finally running entirely through that OPNsense. The only issue that I really couldn't resolve, which I think isn't really that much of an issue, it's something that I can just document in my own documentation base or whatever, right? Was the Verizon router's management IP address. So it's still that same IP address as it's always been, even with the DHCP disabled, and the firmware just kept throwing out and it just kept producing those validation errors. So that's something that I'll probably have to revisit at the end of the series. But for now, I think the most important part of it is done. OPNsense is finally in control of my network. And officially, for the next video, I want to fully build out the VLANs and kind of, segmenting the network as I was previously planning to do, but I thought it would be much better in the fourth part of the series. So that means kind of separating devices and kind of building out something that would feel more like that home lab, kind of enterprise style setup. Hopefully, I was able to work out a few kinks that maybe you ran across or maybe you had a few questions on and you saw it in the video. me going through that process on my own. Now, this is the first time that I've done something like this. So hopefully, we both learn something from it. And if you see anything that maybe I could do better, just feel free to comment that down below. Or if you implemented it in a different way and you think maybe you want to share with others, also feel free to comment that down below. And if you found it helpful, just consider subscribing, liking, and commenting, whatever it is, right? Until next time.